Welcome to In the Know with CaT Bobino. We took a short hiatus, but we're back, and I want to introduce you to my very special guest, Jeanette Quinlan. And I've known Jeanette for many years, but I've actually just asked her to be on the podcast, which I don't know why it took me so long. But Jeanette is a senior program manager for NASA and civil space programs at SpaceLink Corporation. So a lot of people hear NASA, think she works at NASA, but no, she works at SpaceLink with NASA. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be invited and talk to your audience.
Thank you. So we're going to go right and get started. We were having a great conversation about our kids before this, but we're going to be talking about Jeanette today. So what is a senior program manager at SpaceLink? What do you do?
Yeah, so so program managers kind of run the day-to-day operations of a program, do a lot of the financial, modeling to make sure that we're staying on track with our budget. It's a lot of, sometimes we just say herding cats and, making sure people are following up on their action items, writing the action item lists, making sure that everybody's talking to one another. We're just kind of like running the program and making sure that it's moving along, staying on schedule, especially is, a particularly challenging thing, and making sure everybody's got what they need, supporting them in the background to make the program successful. And like you mentioned, I work specifically with our NASA and civil space programs. So that's anything NASA, and then civil space is like the Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency. And we're doing some really exciting work. We've got a picture of the ISS over here, the International Space Station. We're working with a lot of the commercial space station companies that are working on that for the future when the International Space Station retires at the end of the decade.
Oh, wow. Well, okay. I didn't know that it was retiring, which is cool. There's someone I met recently that works at Axiom. So are you working with like that organization?
They are actually one of our partners. We've announced that publicly. We're going to put a terminal on their station end of 2024, maybe 2025 timeframe, which is going to communicate with our satellites. I've got to get used to this, which are here, which are in a higher orbit. So I'll go into maybe a little bit of what we do later, but we are working with Axiom Space on their commercial space habitat, their commercial space station, which is actually going to initially attach to the International Space Station before it becomes its own free-flying station.
So, okay, yeah, we're going to get into exactly what you do, but this is so amazing. So when the space station is retired, then what? What's going to be the space station after that?
So the International Space Station, which has been up there since the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. I certainly remember seeing the habitats as a child as they were being built in the 90s. And so they were launched initially with the space shuttle when that was still running. Mm-hmm. So it's getting old. The systems on there are pretty old. They upgrade it certainly, but it's time for the next one. So I think the contract is through 2030, if I'm not mistaken. And then the plan is to move to the commercial space station. So NASA has funded 4 different companies, or 4 different projects, I should say, because some of those projects have multiple companies involved, to kind of work on what is that next space station going to be. And there could be multiple winners eventually. There could be just one winner eventually. Right now, they're kind of Axiom is actually the first one that was funded, so they're a little bit ahead. But they earlier this year they awarded quite a bit of money to 3 different projects in something called the Commercial LEO Destinations. and that takes them through their first design reviews, their major design reviews, so NASA can kind of get a sense of the projects. And it's quite a bit of taxpayer dollars to do that. But the idea is NASA's not going to be footing the bill. The civil space programs around the world are not going to be footing the bill. It's going to be kind of NASA and private companies. So you're going to start to see more private astronauts going forward. So they might be wealthy individuals who are going, might be somebody from various governments that are going. It might kind of change a little bit of the dynamic, but we'll always have the NASA astronauts too that are going to those space stations.
Yeah, the woman that I met at Axiom, she told me part of what they're going to do. I don't know if I'm at liberty to say, but I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's the plan for the International Space Station, or at least part of it,
Yeah. It's just gonna change how we've done space before, but everything kind of is right now.
Absolutely. That's so cool. All right, so we're gonna get back to you. So what is SpaceLink Corporation? What do they do?
So you could think of our satellites as kind of like a telephone pole in the sky. So what happens right now, if you ever look at like Google Maps and you go to like the satellite view, and you can see a picture of like your street or your house or something like that, that's taken by a satellite that is at about the same, height above the Earth as the International Space Station. They go around every 90 minutes. The problem is they're only over a ground station where they can downlink their data maybe for a 10-minute pass. Best case scenario, if there's clouds, It can be a little bit worse. They might not get that high a link. So not only are they limited in the data that can get down, but also the time that it can get down. So there may only be 1 or 2 ground stations, and you're going around every 90 minutes. So best case, you're getting that data every 45 minutes.
Right.
What we're doing is we're actually building satellites at a higher orbit. So we're building 4 that are going around the equator of the Earth at a much higher orbit. So it's kind of like, trying to look at a city at the top of the Salesforce Tower versus like a 5-story building, So we're kind of at the top of that Salesforce Tower, so we can see all those 5-story buildings that are down there. And so our satellites will always be in view. They can talk to each other. So if you have limits on, data going down to the United States, for example, for some customers, you can do that. So it's really just, we call them relay satellites. It's a telephone pole in the sky. Between our customers in low Earth orbit and our satellites, and between our satellites, we use laser communication. It's actually a very effective way of transmitting high data in space, but it's more limited when you get to the ground because it can be scattered by cloud cover. So we're using radio frequency, a traditional radio frequency from our satellites down to the ground. So we're going to put a laser on the International Space Station through Axiom. It'll be facing away from the Earth. For those who are worried about that. Like I said, at the end of 2024, kind of 2025 time frame. And so we're serving the customers who need data right away, maybe customers who need higher speeds. For example, right now, the International Space Station only gets a couple hundred megabits per second, and we're talking gigabits per second types of speeds. So now when you see videos from the space station, they're very grainy. A lot of times they're like shutting down other non-critical systems just so that they can communicate and get that video feed. So we'll be able to make that, a lot more seamless and higher quality.
Right. And I was just going to ask, like, what is the data that you're getting? What information are you bringing down to Earth? So one, of course, is the International Space Station, the people on there, their communication. What other data or information will we get quicker?
Yeah, so thinking back to those Google imaging satellites, that's kind of for a commercial basis, but you can imagine that there's a lot of satellites imaging. We've seen just with the war in Ukraine recently, or after a disaster, those satellites that are imaging, if you've got a live disaster and you have to wait 90 minutes till you can download your data, or 45 minutes till you can download your data, that might be too late for the search and rescue teams or for any sort of emergency services. So being able to do disaster relief real time and assess the situation real time, that's very important. And certainly, for warfare or, anything that's really time critical there. So it's customers who not only need higher data, but also customers who need the data as quickly as possible.
Gotcha. Oh, wow. So that's amazing. And you're working with government businesses, not a business, but NASA, like that. But then other organizations similar to NASA in Europe, Canada, and in private places too, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And you bring that all together in what capacity?
So I am, for example, when we're putting this laser on the space station, I'm making sure that, the folks who are making the laser are sending us their drawings and their specifications in the right time so that the folks at Axiom can be designing the platform. And, we're making sure, like, even, somebody's using metric, somebody's using imperial units. How do we go between those, and working with the systems engineer on that? Working even with our network, how does this work once you get the data to the ground to be able to get the data to the customer? So, it's setting up weekly meetings. It's making sure, hey, you owe this drawing right now. You owe this specification right now, and moving that kind of thing forward. We've set out a schedule of when we're going to launch, launch to space. So, how do we back up on milestones and the design reviews and the technical meetings that we need to have in order to meet those launch days? So it's, compatibility, schedule, and then staying on budget, of course, too.
Wow. Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, we've known each other for quite a few years.
Yeah.
And you were working on satellites then. So
Yeah.
what got you into satellites? How did you start this type of career path?
Yeah. And it was, it's kind of by chance in a way. So it goes back to when I was a little girl. My parents separated when I was young, and my mom went back to school. She realized she needed to go back to school. She was a Spanish and Italian teacher for Pittsburgh Public Schools. So I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I'm an East Coast transplant out here to California. And she would have to go to the computer center. I'm an older millennial. So, I was a kid, and, we didn't have computers in our house. So she would go to the computer center to write her papers or do research. And she would drop us off at the Carnegie Library because, Pittsburgh has this amazing library system, from philanthropists, from Andrew Carnegie. And I remember just looking in the children's section and finding a book on Sally Ride. And, she had curly dark hair, like she kind of looked like me. And, representation is so important. I don't know what would have happened if I found a book on a male astronaut, but this really clicked with me. And I was like, I want to be an astronaut. So I was kind of interested in anything space. I really wish the internet was around, because in Pittsburgh, there wasn't any aerospace, especially at the time. Now there's one or two companies that are there. There's even a moon museum in Pittsburgh, but there was nothing like that when I was growing up. So I didn't know how you became an astronaut. My dad was a political journalist. My mom was a foreign language teacher. They really didn't know what to do with this girl who was interested in math and science. So I ended up majoring in mechanical engineering. I didn't know what aerospace engineering was. I thought that was for people who want to make airplanes. There just was no guidance. So mechanical engineering was good. It was kind of broad. And then at my career fair, I went to the University of Rochester. There was this company that had, the pop-up banner or whatever they had behind them, they had a picture of a satellite, and they were hiring mechanical engineers and new grads. And I was like, wait a minute, what's going it never occurred to me that there's other things in space just besides people in the shuttle.
Right.
So I applied and ended up working as a thermal engineer to start my career. And so that was 17 years ago. So I was still 21 when I started working because I have a summer birthday. So I was just this young little thermal engineer, but so excited to work in the space industry. I never thought that was a possibility. So I'm really, really grateful to the Career Center for putting that all together. And when I was graduating too, it was kind of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars had just started. So there was a lot of defense hiring as well with young engineers. So that was kind of an easy career path, I guess, for starting to work right after your bachelor's.
Right. And so, yeah, we were talking about that earlier. You started working 21 with a bachelor's and haven't stopped. Really? Right? You've been working in that field since then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is cool. And a lot of people think you have to have a master's, a PhD to get into this, but you've been doing this, as you said, for 17 years, right? With a bachelor's.
In your heat transfer class, for anybody who's taken aerospace or mechanical especially, they say, oh, there's this thing called radiation heat transfer, and we're going to spend half a class on it. You'll never need it in school, like in the real world, whatever. And I did that for 11 years. I did radiation heat transfer because I worked on satellites. So, a lot of it was just on the job and amazing mentors who were so patient with me, teaching me. I had the fundamentals for my education, but what I was doing was so specific. It's really not taught in schools, or maybe like specialized schools. But a lot of it was on the job training. So like my master's was like that first 2 years of like being mentored by colleagues, who were essentially my professors. And I'm really, really grateful to them for their patience and kind of helping to build that foundation, to build upon that foundation that I had from school and learning this specialty.
Well, yeah, and I mean, excuse me, heat transfer goes over my head because, I'm straight biology, straight just miscellaneous animal facts is what you're going to get from me.
You must have the best memorization of everything.
No, because I mean, with engineering, I feel like engineering is a step above physics, and that is all the math you have to remember, what letters go where, what these letters, stand for, which is a lot of memorization that I could never get. That's just, but you did. You got and you got this opportunity to learn on the job, which not everybody gets. So,
yes.
How do you feel? Was that stepping stone for you, getting those opportunities, the mentors, or just being in the right place at the right time?
I think, I was dedicated to I'm going to work, when I graduate, like no matter what it was. And I interviewed at 3 different places. I actually had 3 offers before the end of my first semester senior year of college.
Oh, wow.
So I was going to work. I was going to go into the working world. My 4-year bachelor's degree was just such a gateway for me into like a different lifestyle and being independent. And like, I wanted to be independent from the time I was like 15 or 16. So, it was kind of my way of doing that. I, though, would have never known about the aerospace industry and being able to work in that if it hadn't been for the companies at the career fair brought to me. I think that was a little bit of luck, it being the start of unfortunately the start of 2 wars, that we had just gotten into. But those the defense companies were hiring young graduates, and I was determined to work. So it kind of it was a little bit of determination, of course, and drive. But 3 or 4 years later, we were in the recession, and people who were graduating with the same degree were not finding jobs. So
Right.
let me acknowledge that, and I was able to stay at the jobs and stay employed, but it would have been a lot harder to find a job if I had been a couple of years younger.
Oh wow. I mean that's good to note, and it's good that you brought that up, because a lot of people think you go into a STEM career or a STEM field in your education that boom, automatically you're going to get a job coming out of school, and you got to work, you got to network, or you have to find some sort of opportunity. For you, there was the job fair, which is great, but we don't have job fairs like that in
Yeah.
most places that I know of.
Yeah.
Do you think you think that's something we should be bringing back to college level or even high school level?
I think certainly college level, and it was, I don't even know how they organized it, that career fair. But then there's like big conferences, like NSBE has like a big career fair every year at the end of the year for new graduates to be hired. I think even like San Luis Obispo. I think I've worked for companies that have gone down to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and participated in their career fair. But I wish there was something that every college was doing. But the liberal arts majors were always complaining that the career fair was just for STEM fields. There was nobody like hiring religion majors or hiring English majors at those career fairs. So there was always the complaint, that it was
Right.
just a bunch of like finance and like engineering places.
I get you're not going to be perfect, right? I mean, you can't especially if you're having a career fair in an auditorium, like how many are you going to really fit in there?
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
I mean, I'm not trying to hate or say, anything negative, but I don't know what job you get with a religion, bachelor's degree.
There were a lot of those. There were a lot of those.
I don't know. I honestly do not know, but
Well, one friend who's made a very good career of it became a rabbi. He really needed to be a religion major, but I don't know that everybody else went into that field and stayed in that field.
right.
So
Well, that's cool though. I mean, yeah, that makes me think. I went to a small HBCU and we didn't have a career fair. I think, if we had that opportunity for people to come and talk and say, hey, this is what we have to offer, or we're looking for new grads, then yeah, that'd have been pretty dope, I think.
And companies should be going to
HBCUs. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I've been seeing like virtual job fairs now because of the pandemic.
Right.
So now now you're putting this thought in my head, because I'm like, I see those virtual career fairs. I honestly don't know who's doing what, but I wonder, are they going to the smaller schools, not just HBCUs, but even the small liberal arts schools, or women only colleges? I wonder how that's going.
Yeah, I talked to somebody who works for, I'll put it, a large oil company in the area, who kind of knew the country by the convention centers, because he went and represented his company at all of the NSBE career fairs every year. He knew Pittsburgh by the convention center. And so there's kind of those like large organizations, but I think you have to travel to them, and not every college student is going to have. I certainly didn't have a budget to travel to a career fair.
Yeah, my school is in a really small town, and I know there's no convention center there. So it would have been like an hour away, and not everybody would have had that opportunity.
Yeah.
Good to know. Something definitely to think about as I continue to try and bring STEM to the forefront especially for our kids. But yeah, that's really cool. So I'm going to go back to you, because we went on a tangent. This is what happens on the podcast. It happens all the time. But, so you saw the book on Sally Ride. You decided to go into school. Didn't know what aerodynamics or aerospace engineering was. So mechanical engineering. But still ended up working on satellites for, stuff like that. And what happened to your dream of being an astronaut, though? Did you ever like look into it and apply?
It requires a master's.
Oh, I did not realize.
You want to apply through NASA, it requires a master's, of course. In addition, but if, I mean, I'm not eligible for the private astronaut. We're not doing, no, you can't afford that on an aerospace engineer's budget. I would go up in a heartbeat, still, on any, I'd love to do something that was more the space station, but even these like 8-minute rides, like I take an 8-minute ride, that'd be fine. So it's helped, but I love just supporting the folks that are going into space, and having been around astronauts, I know you've been around some astronauts, like they just like, there's just a magic to them. So
I feel like the dummy in a room when I'm around people like that. It's like, oh, okay, great. You've done this. You've done all of this. Okay.
We all have imposter syndrome around.
Right.
It's, they literally have like the coolest job.
Yeah. But, you get to work with all these organizations that are going to space. So, you rub elbows with the right people. You get that extra seat on the ride that's going up anyway. You never know.
I hope so. And it's fun even to go to Houston. And we do so, Axiom is located really close to the Johnson Center. And there's just like little pictures of astronauts, and everything's called like Apollo Street and Gemini Street. And like, it's just this like space nerdy kind of part of Houston.
Yeah, I hear there's a bar right outside the Johnson Space Center that has all the pictures of the astronauts on there that like all of them go to when they do whatever they're doing at the Johnson Center in Houston. And
I've been to one of those.
Oh, have you? I have not yet, but now that I know it exists, next time I'm in Houston, I'm going to go over there and check it out. Which is cool. But yeah, you never know. Like, I had Dr. Cyan Proctor on my podcast.
Yes.
And like a few years later, now she's going to space. So you never know, is what I'm saying. You just never know.
Yeah, first Black woman to pilot a spacecraft.
Yes. And she piloted it. I'm assuming, I can't remember if she has her pilot license, but I know she's a geologist. Her PhD is in geology, but she was a pilot for this, which is cool.
Yeah.
Actually,
inspiration for a documentary if you haven't already. It's really good.
Yeah, no, I've seen it. I've reached out to her, and told her congratulations and all that good stuff. She's big time now, so I barely get a response anymore, but I'm proud of her.
You knew her before she was big.
Yeah, I knew, because I reached out to her because we were both on Genius with Stephen Hawking, different episodes, but that's how I met her, because she was on an episode of that, and I was like, oh, cool, we had great conversation, and now look at her, now she's big name, doing all this big stuff, and I'm like, congratulations. But that's cool. So with what you're doing now with the satellites and the work you're doing at SpaceLink, first of all, how long have you been at SpaceLink?
A little bit over a year. The company's been around about less than 2 years. So we're still a startup. We're only about 33 people at the company right now.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's cool. And like, you got there though over a year ago. I'm guessing it was less than that.
Yeah. I think it was probably around 20-ish, 25-ish.
So what made you go toward the startup type of area?
I started my career at big aerospace companies, and then just being in the Bay Area. In 2014, I worked at my first space startup. I got kind of recruited by a former colleague at one of the large aerospace companies who had gone to them. They were looking for thermal engineers as a specialty. And he reached out and said, why don't you submit? So I was actually very happy where I was, but I was like, I got to try this thing. I'm in the Bay Area. These space startups are starting to happen. And I've been at startups or very small companies, or like I worked for an aerospace startup accelerator for a little while, for about a year and a half, since 2014. So
wow.
I really like the ability to like pivot and change very quickly, not have and have a lot of freedom in how you can kind of design the system. But yeah, I think I'm like, I sort of wanted to work at a bigger company, but SpaceLink was great because it's a lot of people that I worked with before. It's a lot of veterans in the industry working at a small company. So, we bring that experience of this is how it has been done, but then we have that freedom to change very quickly, much quicker than you could at a big company.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, being a startup gives you, I know it gives you the opportunity to have your voice heard. So much
Yes.
smaller people, everyone is given the opportunity to speak and say, yeah, we should go this direction or this direction, right?
Yeah.
What do you see for the future of you at SpaceLink?
I'm working with so I'm working, a lot with the business development person who specializes in our NASA programs. And like every time he wins a program, I'm like, I don't know if I can handle more, more and more programs. I'm like, you're too successful at this. You're too good at this. So, eventually I'd love to then manage other program managers for the NASA and civil space, or even, manage other program managers, maybe do a little bit of commercial or a little bit of the Department of Defense customers, DoD customers that we have. So for right now, managing the Axiom program that we talked about, and then another smaller NASA study that we have going on. But if we keep on being successful, then hopefully, I'm managing lots of folks. And then I really like kind of, having that engineering foundation, but going into the operations side of things.
Okay, cool. So, just a reminder that we are live on Facebook and YouTube. So, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We have one from Danielle, said she was a little late, but wants to know what kind of work do you do on the satellites, and what, if any, involvement do you have with launching satellites?
Yeah. So right now, I'm a program manager. We kind of make sure that everything stays on schedule. I'm making sure that we've got all the, meeting all the milestones, staying on budget and things like that. But I started my career as a thermal engineer, and a thermal engineer makes sure that everything on the satellite stays at the right temperature from, when it's on the ground, when it's being built, when it's being tested, to that first day on orbit, and maybe the 20th year that it's on orbit. No matter how you want to use the satellite, no matter how it's oriented and orbiting the Earth. So I've sat launch, I've sat in mission control with the headset, which was definitely a career highlight. So I've never been to a launch base. I want to see I've seen a launch live, but not of my own satellites. But I want to, go and like see something. I've sat in mission control while something else launches very far away in Kazakhstan, actually. But never, been able to see my satellite launch or my work launch real time.
Christina says, I'm still thinking about the ISS retiring, the International Space Station. Yeah, I was shocked to hear that too. I didn't realize, it makes sense, but I didn't realize that was something that was going to be happening.
We'll get new shiny space stations up there.
So are the new International Space Stations being built now?
More of the commercial space stations.
Okay.
Actually, other countries like China has a space station. They have astronauts that are up there. We're probably not going to necessarily collaborate with them and send U.S. astronauts up there. But there is a Chinese space station that's up there. And then we've got these, 4 different commercial companies that are working with NASA on funding for the next space station.
Right, right. Yeah, and we kind of spoke about that earlier. There's some, commercial companies that's building them. If you want to know what Axiom is doing, you can call me. I'm not going to say it out on, thing because I don't know if I'm supposed to, but it's so cool. But yeah, there's private companies that are doing that. Danielle asked, what's the purpose functions of various satellites?
Yeah, so there's the satellites that are imaging the Earth. Think of your Google Maps. When you're on Google Maps and you switch to satellite view and you can see your street or your house. There's lots of satellites like that. There's ones that are even working in different wavelengths. So there's like radar satellites, synthetic aperture radar satellites that can see through clouds. Those are really good for disaster relief. If there's a hurricane or something like that and you don't have really good visibility, you can actually see through the clouds with that type of technology. There's hyperspectral imaging. There's all sorts of different imaging satellites. And then there's communication satellites. So if you're in an airplane and you're getting Wi-Fi, that's coming from a satellite. DirecTV, Dish Network, Sirius and XM radio. Those are all, satellite radios. Those are actually satellites that are up there that are giving that signal. So those are kind of the 2 primary, I would say, are the Earth observation in some way, and then the communication satellites.
Right. And something that we had talked about earlier were the lasers that are being used that helps, I think, for some of the later people, maybe re-explain how lasers are important on satellites, please.
Yeah, so everything communicates in traditionally radio frequency. You've got radio frequency receivers in your cell phone. There's radio frequency everywhere. But lasers are, it's still a frequency, but it's like a much higher frequency. So you can put a lot more data through that than you can regular free radio frequency. It's really good in space because you can send large data sets really far. I mean, we're even looking at solutions around the moon, where we'd be able, there's a lot of work going on trying to go back to the moon. So there's, we're working on a couple of, proposals that are related to putting lasers around the moon and being able to transmit data for astronauts that are going to go back, or exploration that's going to be going back to the moon. But it does have trouble going through clouds. So when you have a ground station, it's very, very sensitive to clouds. So we use radio frequency for that because that's a little bit more mature technology and has less chance of having outages.
All right. Well, that's cool. Being able to see through clouds. No, I think they're having a hard time with the clouds.
But, there's imaging satellites that see through the clouds too.
Oh, okay.
I think that's what they're referring to.
Okay.
So you send this like radar signal from the satellite down, and based on kind of where it hits and hitting different like levels of, I could see the outline of a ship in a port or something like that, and then that signal bounces off of the Earth and then back to the satellite, and the satellite can read that image. It looks really ugly if you just look at the image, but there's lots of like software that can kind of interpret those kind of images.
Wow, that's so cool. And thank you everyone for all the questions, comments. I appreciate it. Hello to the Black Math Academy. I see you there. And Danielle asks, do you collaborate with intelligence agencies and or other countries?
Yes, we do have a whole division of the company that's working with the Department of Defense. So that's DARPA. We've announced some DARPA programs as well. I watch too many thriller movies. Don't believe everything in the movies. But we do work with the Department of Defense. Certainly they need to be able to get images back, real time. You can, think of disaster relief or wartime, type of applications there. And then, we can work with other countries. There's limitations on some countries, just because of geopolitical reasons. So, there are some that we're not really able to collaborate with. But we're very friendly with a lot of European countries, a lot of Asian countries as well. So, you see a lot of cross collaboration there. And we could even work with agencies there, and on the civil space side, we've got Canadian Space Agency, European Space Agency, JAXA, which is the Japanese space agency. All of those folks also have modules on the International Space Station. So there's, a history of peace and collaboration.
Well, that's cool that at least we have some places that like the U.S. still and still willing to work with us on various things. Because I'm not going to even go there. But that's thank you for that question, and it's cool that that's the work you're doing. And earlier, Jeanette mentioned, as a program manager, that's all her hands in those many pots, bringing all of those people together, making sure that program is working, doing all the things that they need to do, say they're doing, in collaboration with one another. So it's really cool that we're getting to learn what's going on behind the scenes, because I, quite honestly, myself included, do we really know how many space stations are there? How many satellites are out there? How many things is being used? We just use our phone. We use our computers. I was on a plane recently with the internet, but I don't think about how it works, right? And so there's all these different satellites. And I mean, I'm kind of afraid to ask, if you know this answer, how many satellites are up there?
Oh my gosh, it's got to be thousands at this point. There's some satellites that are as small as a shoebox. They're literally 4 inches by 4 inches by a foot long. I mean, there's some that are even smaller than that. But people have even built entire businesses based on these small satellites, and they've launched hundreds of satellites. And there's lots of those companies that are out there. So there's thousands. I mean, we worry about them running into the space stations. We worry about, where there's humans on board. We worry about them colliding into each other, and then they create these like debris fields, and then that debris goes into another satellite, and so there's whole agencies that track these kind of things and make sure that they aren't supposed to run into each other. But there's a lot out there.
And we don't, and when they're not working or they're obsolete or, no longer available, they just stay there, right? They become space garbage. I don't know if that's the right term.
Yeah, there's a lot of dead satellites up there, we call them. And what you do, so there's a little tiny bit of atmosphere, on those satellites, especially the ones that are close to the Earth in our imaging. So eventually it'll drag down the satellite, but you have to prove that your satellite will deorbit in I think it's 25 years or something like that. So it could be up there for 25 years, and then everything burns up in the atmosphere. There's a lot of safety checks to make sure that everything that's on there will burn up. You're not allowed to use certain materials that are a little bit more dangerous, that don't necessarily burn up. And then for some of those satellites that go really far out, like the Sirius XM satellites, a lot of the ones that you're using for internet in your airplane, they are required to have just enough fuel on board left that they go to a higher orbit. We call it the graveyard orbit, where they go out there and live the rest of
their lives. That's where they
their
are.
lives out there. So there's a lot less satellites that are out there, but we've been sending satellites that far up for decades. They work for about 15-20 years, and then they have to have just enough fuel to kind of get out of the way of the other satellites.
Wow. That's okay. Cool. All right. I think you answered this question. Are satellites used by airport towers to monitor plane flights?
I think they're using radio frequency for the most part, just between the airplane and the tower.
The
The
tower.
tower. I don't know that they're necessarily using satellites, but the airplanes do like send a ping that goes up to the satellite to show its location. And years ago, when there was like the plane that like went missing, there's a lot of work done about like how do we make sure that there's more frequent, pings going to the satellite so that we know, and that's just a very low data, like an IoT, like kind of, level of data.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, then, yeah, you didn't answer that, so I'm glad I asked. The Black Math Academy, excuse me. Have you heard about these 5G capable satellites that Omnispace and Lockheed Martin are working on? How do they work?
So I'm a thermal engineer, so all I know is that like they cause a lot of heat. So I'm not going to be able to talk, in depth as somebody who's like a radio frequency engineer or knows those payloads a little bit more. But they're essentially cell phone towers in the sky as well. And they're, any sort of 5G capable satellites are, I believe they're generally sending, kind of relaying the signal. And that's what, when you're in your airplane and you say like, hey, I want to go to CNN.com, and it goes up there, relays back down, goes back up, and then goes back to you in the in your airplane seat. Essentially, I mean, it's like we had a CEO once who just said like, oh, they're just fancy like telephone poles, and we're like, no, it's a whole satellite. You can't talk about my satellite like that. But it's a very expensive telephone pole.
It is what it is. Right. So thanks for joining. She said she just got off work. Thank you for joining anyway. And Lim said it's amazing how many satellites are out there. Got to see some of them when I visit NASA in Houston. Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah. So let's. The Black Math Academy asked, I'm curious about the math you use in your field. What kind of math do you use for satellites?
There's so much math. That's a great question. There's orbital mechanics. So, we're talking physics. We're talking like, that making sure that, oh my God, there's just math everywhere. Like, where do we even begin? I love that question. Orbital mechanics, launch, there's kind of these launch equations of like the more fuel that you put on, the more powerful the rocket is, but then the heavier it is. So you need to put more fuel on in order to overcome the fact that it's heavier. So there's rocket equations. I was a thermal engineer, so like I mentioned, I was doing radiation heat transfer. There's tons of equations there with how everything is interacting. We use simulation tools because it just gets so complicated with the way that everything's interacting with each other. You've got solar loading coming from the sun. You've got, blockages coming from solar rays. You've got this bouncing off of this part of the satellite. And then you're radiating your heat to space at the same time. So you can kind of do these like hand calcs, but then not as easy as a parabolic equation. Yeah. Well, we use temperature to the fourth. There's so many variables. Yes. Black Math Academy said variables all over the place. There are. I mean, it's a lot of, equations and, substitution for what is this property of this material. I like practical applications of math as an engineer. So I always did better in math when we used an example. Satellites, you can do that. Propulsion equations, like how you make a satellite move when you launch it. Calculating where you are, where your trajectory is, back to the orbital mechanics. There's like math in every part, and I'm sure like a solar array engineer is yelling at me for not mentioning all of the equations involved with like turning solar energy into usable energy on the spacecraft.
Special geometry, perhaps. I see, and you were getting on me, Jeanette, about just my animal knowledge, which is so basic compared to like all the math you have to know. Oh, spatial geometry. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got, I'm back to, a thermal engineer. You've got these solar array panels you can kind of see there that are twisting, so that they're always facing the sun while the satellite is also going around the Earth. So the angle, changes, the ability to radiate heat changes because the solar array is changing as you go around the orbit. A lot of, I've used a lot of geometry as well. So a lot of algebra, a lot of like advanced algebra, and then a lot of geometry as well.
So here's an interesting question that you may or may not know the answer to. Is this the math that Katherine Johnson used? Are we still using her math?
It is incredible to me that we did all of that on slide rules.
Yeah.
We went to the moon on slide rules. But yeah, those are the foundational. The folks doing the Apollo missions and the missions before that wrote the math for all of this. The launch equations, the orbital. They were figuring all of that out and like by hand with. We have a lot of simulations and models, now that do that. Even the thermal software was written in Fortran. So I had to use Fortran in school because all of this stuff, all this software was written, back in the 60s when, you had punch cards. I mean, you've seen that picture of the MIT engineer with next to the stack of like Fortran punch cards, and her code. Yeah, we're still coding in Fortran because that's what it's based on.
Wow, that's crazy. He said, oh wow. So okay, the Black Math Academy said, thank you for that. I love to share this pragmatic math with my students. And I spoke to Katherine Johnson last year. That's incredible. Her favorite math, yeah. Her favorite math subject is geometry. Go figure, right?
I would believe that.
Yeah. Wow, punch cards, right, Lim? Let me scroll back because I know there was a question I missed. If you know the answer. So what's next for space? What do we look forward to in the future?
Certainly more ubiquitous space travel, for folks that are interested in that. There's a lot going on and, looking towards the moon. Going back there, there's an astronaut named Jeanette who's supposed to launch. So I'm very excited about that. Jeanette Epps, watch her. I'm so excited for her to finally go up. There just more and more the barrier of entry, coming down, the cost coming down for people who want to build a business, based on space, people who do analytics based on space. I mean, think about like when you got the iPhone, they didn't know what was going to happen with that. But now that I think about that with space data, we're going to have all this data of, the environment changing and, disaster relief. What are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with that with climate change? Not to mention, I mean, going back to your biology, there's so much biological research that's done on the ISS, and that's going to be, done on Axiom and any of the other folks that are doing space stations. And I know that that research is very pivotal. I couldn't give specific examples, but I hear that as I go to conferences and things like that. I mean, the biology that's done on the space station is incredible. There's so much research going on there.
Yeah, and I know of one biologist, space biologist. I know that's not her tone. She's going to be mad at me at NASA, who does research on biological. Oh, okay. Well, we are coming to the end of the podcast. We only have a few minutes. I do see one more question. Extraterrestrials.
There's an institution called the SETI Institution. I think it's in Northern California, where they are trying to make contact with extraterrestrials. I don't think they've done it. I think it's been featured in some movies and things like that. It's SETI. Especially with all these James Webb images coming back, like, you have to think there's other life out there. I mean, you really do. Is it like ours? What is it? What is it like? I just think, the probability that we're the only life out there is so low. And I'd be curious what you think as a biologist too.
Yeah, no, and I've had this discussion with people at NASA, and when we think of extraterrestrials, we think of life on another planet that's like us, intelligent life, somebody we can communicate with, but we don't think of bacterial life or very small amoeba-like life.
Yeah.
And that type of life on another planet means there's life on another planet. It's an extraterrestrial that we've contacted, but they can't communicate with us. So is there extraterrestrials? Yes. I mean, if we have sulfur vents here that have life in there, so if we have that, then they can be on another planet. Is it intelligent life? Is it life that can talk to us? Well, that remains to be seen.
Do you think we're using radio frequency waves, doing that the last 100 years? The universe has been around for millions of years,
Right.
Maybe somebody just hasn't gotten around to doing radio frequency and, in the spectrum that we're looking at. But I think there's even some life, signs of life on like moons around Jupiter and, and things like that. We're trying to find, signs of life even a little bit closer to home than these distant galaxies.
Yeah, and one of my favorite comics is Calvin and Hobbes, and there was one strip where they was like, he saw litter and all that stuff, and he was like, one of the signs that there are intelligent life is the fact that they don't want to talk to us.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, look how we treat our planet. They probably don't want to come here. They don't want to deal with us. So a couple of comments before we head out. So she said there's a famous guy in Mexico who does UFO research. Cool. The Black Math Academy says Sojourner Weaver and those 8 feet tall killing machines. We don't want that at all. And Danielle said extraterrestrial life could be traveling on asteroids, meteors, biological gas. And, we've seen, or not me personally, NASA's seen water on asteroids and small debris, and if there's water, there's probably life somewhere. So before we cut out though, is there any last thing that you want to add or share before we end our podcast tonight?
Thank you for all the questions. I love all of these questions, and I hope you've learned a little bit about just this part of STEM. It's just a little part of STEM. It's so broad, and thank you for highlighting so many different careers and so many different ways to get into this field. And even for people who aren't math or science is their forte, we need artists. We need artists to do these drawings. We need public relations people. We need recruiters. We need it's not just for people that are in math and science. You can help in the aerospace world in so many different fields. Engineers are terrible artists. Engineers are terrible at PR. So we really need the specialists, in those kind of fields.
Yeah. There's, when you come across a good artist that's in STEM, that's just, amazing to do. So thank you for everybody again for joining. Thank you, Jeanette, for taking your time out tonight to be on this show. I appreciate everyone, and good night.
Good night. Thanks,